So we will not lose any time for our presenter. Welcome, everyone, to our joint web lecture of the 6.6 and 6.7 special interest groups of the early. Welcome from around the world. Just a short information on this web lecture series, and the idea of it is that we're trying to bridge the two topics that the SIGs have, namely like instructional design, educational technology, and learning processes. And I'm delighted you're joining us from all over the world, as we already had free web lecture series before. And I think it's a very promising approach to have insights from researchers. And today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Noah Schroeder, who is from the University of Florida and currently a researcher in the Department of, I wrote it down, Computer and Information Science and Engineering. Um,
Yes,
and
going for the longest title ever for department name.
Yeah. So they want to fill it with all the words that are important. And he also serves as a project manager for an National Science Foundation funded institute, AI institute that is called Invite, which is really interesting and focuses on inclusive, intelligent technologies for education. And just a small wrap up on his history. He earned his PhD in educational psychology from Washington State University and previously also held a position as professor there and now joined the University of Florida. And I really have to mention that his interdisciplinary background spans a lot of disciplines like biology, psychology, computer science, and he's very active also on LinkedIn. I follow a lot of his posts where he is now talking a lot about AI and large language models. Um, but Noah's research is also very deep and broad in terms of other topics. His Google Scholar profile already shows over more than 2,700 citations in areas like pedagogical agents, multimedia learning, also a lot of meta-analysis. He's also doing a lot of research on how to do research analysis, meta-analysis, where I got also in contact with him previously. And one of his topics is also like how socially interactive virtual humans can be embedded in learning environments. And his work often tackles not just whether educational technologies work, but also how and why they do. And that's super important for us as educational researchers. And by also using not only meta-analysis, but also thoughtfully designed studies to uncover underlying mechanisms. So he first offered a lot of landmark studies in Educational Psychology Review, one of our highest impact journal in our field, also on concept maps, but also on spatial contiguity and other fields. So I'm very happy to have him here today. And today he will present a topic that is also well covered in our in both of our special interest groups, namely pedagogical agents and how they contribute to engagement, motivation, cognitive support, and also any social processes. And this topic is, I think, at the heart of our SIGs, and that's why we value very much that he's here today. His presentation will be 45 minutes. And after that, you have 50 minutes to ask questions, again, via this Q&A tool of Zoom. So you can already ask questions throughout the presentations, but also when we start the Q&A session. Then we will curate these questions, combine if there's any redundancy in it, and ask them on behalf of you at the last 50 minutes. So please join me in welcoming Noah Schroeder. Noah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. It is an absolute privilege to be here with you guys today talking about pedagogical agents. I am working on getting my screen share going. Hopefully that worked. Yes, okay, I see some nods, great. Okay, I'm gonna move video off to the side because I am incredibly easily distracted. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about pedagogical agents and where we are now. And this is a really interesting area because, as you mentioned, I really love large language models. I'm also very critical of large language models. And this is one of those things where they're going to have a really big impact on this field. And we're only just starting to see the beginning of it. And that's promising and also terrifying simultaneously. So I'll talk more about that as we go forward. The work I'm going to show you guys today is based on work that we've done over the last 2 years as part of the Invite Institute, and we're focused on helping kids persist with their studies and be resilient in their studies and learn to collaborate better. And a key part of the systems that we're developing are pedagogical agents. So when our institute was first funded, we spent a reasonable amount of time understanding what the complete landscape is of pedagogical agents. So from that, I am going to say, I'm going to present the results of 4 different studies that we did. I am going to be talking relatively surface level because I don't think I can get to all 4 in depth in 45 minutes. And I also have a tendency to talk absolutely forever when I get excited about things. So I'm trying to contain my excitement a little bit because I've been working with pedagogical agents a long time and I really enjoy talking about them. So this work wouldn't be possible without the wonderful collaborators who helped on it. I'm going to be showing you 2 meta-analyses, a systematic review and a scoping review. And we worked with researchers from all over the country and also Steffi Heidig out of Germany. And it was a real privilege to be able to work with these people. And all of them are great scholars. A couple of them are graduate students, and I'm really excited about the graduate students and what work they have coming out of this and related things. It's very exciting to me. So as a quick roadmap of where I will be going over the next 42 minutes and 15 seconds, hopefully, so I don't talk too much, we're going to really briefly talk about what a pedagogical agent is and the theoretical underpinnings of agents. We'll then move into a quick overview of what we've done over the last 2 years, which includes a scoping review of pedagogical agents in K-12 education, a meta-analysis, a systematic review looking at how to design pedagogical agents, and also a separate meta-analysis looking in depth at the motivational measures around pedagogical agents. And I'll talk more about why that needed to be separated in a little bit. That's going to leave us at this spot of where are we with the current state of pedagogical agents. And then we're going to end by talking about what the future holds. And this is where I think I am most excited, but also a little concerned. And I'll get to that when we get there. So real quickly, for those of you who are not familiar with pedagogical agents, they are essentially lifelike characters that you would see on a screen, and their main purpose is to facilitate learning. There's a lot of other types of characters out there, including conversational agents, motivational agents, and virtual humans. There's like 99 different tag words, but they all can fall under this umbrella of pedagogical agent if they are designed to help kids learn. And so that was our main defining feature, is that the overall design was focused on improving learning. It wasn't necessarily focused on just sparking conversation about nothing or something like that. It was very much focused on learning outcomes. So as we started the Institute and we started thinking about agents in particular, there were a couple major gaps that we saw. First, there was no prior synthesis in a systematic way on the effects of pedagogical agents in K-12 education. So there were a few meta-analyses that included the age of the learner as a moderator analysis, but there was nothing specifically focused on K-12. And then those reviews that already existed, including my own, we often used relatively narrow search criteria. Our search terms were sometimes only 3 or 4 words, and it was not as all-encompassing as the field had become. So another factor was a methodological limitation, including my own work, where in the past we were using conventional meta-analytic methods, and now we have 3-level meta-analysis, we have robust variance estimation. We essentially have ways that I think we can use more of the data in our analyses to get what I would consider to be more accurate or precise estimates than we could before. And at the end of the day, what we were finding is between these different meta-analyses, we were finding conflicting views on the effectiveness of pedagogical agents for helping K-12 students. Some said they had advantages. Others said there was no significant advantage. So we really wanted to clarify this. So the purpose of our review, well, really the set of reviews we did, was we were aiming to conduct the most comprehensive analysis of pedagogical agents on K-12 learners that had been done to date. Now, in one aspect, that's kind of a low bar because, as I just said, there weren't any existing ones very focused on K-12. But we knew from reading just random studies in the field that there were a lot more studies around pedagogical agents in K-12 education than we had ever captured in these existing reviews. So we really wanted to make sure we captured the whole landscape. Second, we wanted to go beyond looking at just learning outcomes. Now, a lot of meta-analyses in the field look at retention and transfer separately. Some of them also look at motivation, but if you're a motivation scholar, you know motivation isn't necessarily just one thing. There's multiple theories of motivation, etc. I'm not a motivation scholar, so I'm not going to pretend like I am and go on and on about all of the different types of motivation right now. The other thing that we wanted to do was use more robust methods than we had in the past so we could account for more data. And we also wanted to identify some of the potentially moderating variables that were there. So I'm not going to talk a lot about theory, but I do want to just give you a real general high-level background of why pedagogical agents might improve learning. So this is the Castle theory, which kind of like my department's name is very, very long. I think it's cognitive affective social theory of learning in digital environments. Is that right? Yeah, I see Sasha nodding. Yeah, okay. So we have Castle theory, which is based on the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, and then it's also based on the cognitive affective theory of learning with media. So the long story short, or the part that I want you to focus on, is this idea of social cues. Now, pedagogical agents are kind of unique in that since they do look like virtual humans in some cases, we can have them express social cues that other things may not be able to express. And the general idea that I want you to capture is if by expressing these social cues with agents, this is going to activate some things, which we're going to call the social schemata. They are going to invoke some sort of processes, and that is going to impact how we learn. So the way I think about this isn't necessarily a conceptually accurate way. This is just a Noah way, is I think of these social schemata and processes as almost like a filter or that the information has to pass through. So when we pick up these social cues, it gets filtered by what we know and what we think we're seeing, and that's going to impact how we learn that information. So that's the way that I conceptualize it, even though it's not, specifically accurate according to theory. So that's the way that I think about this. And what I want you to be thinking about when we talk about why pedagogical agents might work is social cues. Social cues in theory can improve learning. So we also situate this within an existing design framework. This came out in 2011, and there's two different components to it. The first one is the pedagogical agents conditions of use model, which is what you see here on the screen. I'm not going to go through every single component, but there's really 4 different things that you need to know about here. The first one is that the type of learning environment can matter. The second is that learner factors can matter and influence how people learn. The third is kind of this umbrella of the pedagogical agent in the sense that it encompasses both the function of the agent, that's what it's doing and what it's intended to do, and the visual design of the agent. And then when we start talking about the visual design of the agent, the challenge is it becomes a really complex space really, really fast. So you can see this diagram here, and this is breaking it down into 3 levels. The global level is the top. This is a choice like, do we use an actual human or do we use like a dog or a frog or a bird? Next, we go into the medium level, which as you can see is technical decisions and the choice of the character that they use. And last is the detail level. This is things like how old does the character appear? What type of clothing does it wear? What gender does it appear as? What weight is it? All of those types of factors. Now, I mention these things for 2 reasons. One, in my personal opinion, this is the most robust framework we have for understanding how to design agents because it talks about all of these different aspects, the learning environment, the learner, the function of the agent, and the design. And it gets into these kind of these little details of agent design. So we chose this framework because of its robustness, but we also use this as a coding framework for all of the systematic reviews that we did moving forward. So when I start talking about the reviews here in a moment, I'm not going to go into each individual thing that we coded for every single study because that would take me forever. Instead, I just want you to be thinking about this general framework, thinking about functions of the agent, the design of the agent in detail, such as the high level, the medium level, and the low level, and also aspects of the learner and aspects of the learning environment, because we coded for all of those things. In total, I think we had something like 30 or 40 different things that we ended up coding for so that we could understand really the landscape of how people were designing agents. Okay, so an overview of what we've done over the last few years. We examined a series of questions. First and foremost, we wanted to understand the landscape around pedagogical agents in K-12 education. So this is our scoping review. Second, we asked the question of, do they improve learning and what actually moderates this? This is our meta-analysis. Third, we wanted to know if the actual design of the agent matters. This is a question people haven't looked at in previous research syntheses. It's all been primarily looking at, do they work compared to non-agent conditions? We don't really have many analyses looking at which type of design is more effective than others from systematic review perspective. Last but not least, we have this separate meta-analysis that is focusing on learner motivation and digging much more into those motivational constructs. And we want to know what moderates each of these. So let's start with the scoping review. So I'm not going to run through every single detail on here because it would take a long time. But the takeaway point that I want you guys to have is our search string, we used all sorts of different words around pedagogical agents. We used virtual human, embodied agents, virtual characters, conversational agents, motivational agents. Next, we tried to capture every word we could find that was related to something around K-12 education. So primary, secondary, middle, high, K-12, elementary, all of those types of things. Third, this is where we're trying to isolate our outcomes. Now, we had two main outcomes that we wanted to identify in the beginning. One was focused on learning. The second was motivation. And the reason you see all of these different constructs here for motivational constructs is because we had a specific set of theories that we had pulled out of the pedagogical agent literature, and we were trying to capture all of the words that were common within those theories. And that's how we ended up there. We searched 9 different databases, and we had no limitation to the publication type or the publication time period. So we were looking for studies from all time. I'm realizing I said I wasn't going to go through every detail of this, and I am anyway. So, like I said, I get excited and I talk about things. We had about 2,000 studies when we started. In the end, we ended up with 112 that met the inclusion criteria. So the inclusion criteria for our scoping review was pretty broad. It needed to have at least one condition with a pedagogical agent, and this pedagogical agent could not be an actual person. So like there's a couple studies out there that would have like a video of me teaching on the screen and say that I am a pedagogical agent. And under some definitions, that is fully correct. That can be accurate, but that's not what we were looking for here. We were looking specifically for virtual characters. So we excluded things that had to do with an actual human. It had to be a study with K-12 learners as the participants, and they had to collect some sort of primary data. We didn't want to look at conceptual work or theoretical work. So the next few slides are going to be really quick, just looking at the overall landscape of the field and what it looked like at the time we did this search, which was towards the end of 2023, if I remember correctly. So as you can see, the number of studies with K-12 agents or agents in K-12 has been relatively consistent across from basically 2009 until now. And most of them are appearing as journal articles. Some of them are appearing as conference proceedings. I was kind of surprised there were only 10 dissertations. I really expected more dissertations to be found. I'm not really sure why this is. I don't have a good theory. I was just surprised by that. But I know a lot of students, at least in the US, are for their dissertation work are interested in working with K-12 students. So I was surprised to find that. We found that most studies were being conducted in the United States by far, and then there were fewer studies across the rest of the world, as you can see here. Notably, something that is not included in here is the studies that did not say where the study was conducted, and that was a huge number of studies. If I remember right, I think it was like 50. 50 of our 112 didn't say what country they conducted the research in, and that kind of blew my mind to some extent. The other thing that we need to consider, and this is just as like a little bit of background, generally speaking, for those who aren't familiar with agents, in agent research, I would say historically, we were kind of bad about reporting details in studies sometimes. Like if we look back at the early research from like 2000 to let's say 2015, as that time goes on, we see more and more detailed reporting. At least that's my personal opinion. So like the earlier studies, sometimes we don't see reliability about measures reported. Sometimes we don't see like the study design. There was just the standards have been increasing over time for what needs to be reported. In terms of participant trends, this is one that I found quite interesting personally, mostly because I didn't know what to expect when we started coding. But as you can see, the vast majority of the studies took place with primary students, which would be K through 6 in our coding scheme. And then the second highest amount was with secondary education, which was through grades 7 and 8. It might have also included 9. I don't remember the coding scheme off the top of my head. I was expecting that it was going to be with older students, so I was quite surprised to see it was with younger students. In terms of what types of agents are being used, again, this was something that was very surprising to me. Working with younger students, I thought we were going to find more agents that looked like young kids. That was not the case. Instead, we found a lot of studies working with adult agents, and we found a lot of studies working with non-human agents. And then we found another big set of studies, about a third, that worked with agents of multiple ages. So this was surprising to me. I really honestly expected it to be much more skewed towards younger looking agents and non-human agents. But hey, that's why we do research. We learn stuff and we find surprises, and it's fun. In terms of what types of agents are being used, we categorize this based on what type of agent the authors claimed their agent was. As you can see, the vast majority claim they were pedagogical agents. We were curious about this because conversational agents foundationally are designed a little bit different than pedagogical agents, but conversational agents can still be used as pedagogical agents. So we were really curious as to the overlap. In terms of the role of the agent in the learning environment, this was not surprising, but intriguing. And I say that because it's very easy to design a character that just talks. If it just stands on the screen and talks, it just acts as an information source. That's very simple to design. So of course, we see a lot of studies there. Similarly, we see a lot of studies with agents that are doing coaching or scaffolding, which is really interesting. But something that was really striking to me is we still only had 10 studies where the agents were demonstrating or modeling a task. And I think this is really creative. This is going to get tied in later. I prepared way too many slides. I got to talk a little faster. Sorry. Where are agent studies being conducted? The vast majority are quantitative studies, and the vast majority were taking place in classrooms. These studies are generally being taken place on computers. So the agents are appearing on a computer screen rather than a tablet or something like that. And most of them were focused around science or mathematics content. So one of the things that I thought was quite intriguing to me and surprising. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this than I wanted. So previous meta-analyses around pedagogical agents have been relatively small. Sometimes they have like 30 studies, sometimes 40 studies. But as I mentioned, we found 112. The difference is we included studies that only had one group and would never qualify for a meta-analysis like they've traditionally been done. So in the chart on the left, you can see the blue column would be studies with only one group, and the red column would be studies with two groups. So I find this really interesting because the number of participants is listed along the bottom. And as you can see, for example, we had 6 studies that were experimental studies and had more than 200 participants. But these don't really appear in previous meta-analyses. And this made me really curious, like what is happening where previous meta-analyses were excluding these things? It was just a curiosity. The second piece goes back to the not reported data. So one of the challenges in the field is that we have a lot of studies that are short term, but we have very few studies that are longer term. This is a historical problem in the field of agents. It's been known since like probably the mid 2000s, if not earlier. And if we look here towards the bottom, we can see we have this not reported. 56 of our 112 did not report the duration of their study. And to me, that's crazy because I think about submitting to a journal now, like if today, if you submit a journal article and you don't say how long it got you, the students interacted with the software, like reviewers they're gonna mention that. They're gonna notice and be like, well, was this 30 seconds or was this a week, right? So this was kind of striking to me that we didn't understand, like we didn't have many studies talking about the overall duration of the study and how long people actually worked with the agents. But importantly, we are starting to see some studies that are more than 4 weeks long, which was a major limitation in the field previously. In terms of what outcomes people were interested in, a lot of learning, a lot of motivation, a lot of perception, very little cognitive load. Okay, so let's get into the meta-analysis portion. So search was generally the same. The way that we structured this is we used that overall scoping review search to get our 112 studies. From there, we knew we had a basic sample of studies that included agents, were focused on K-12 and measured learning. So we took those 112 and we narrowed them down even further. And we looked at only those that included an agent and a non-agent group in an experiment and measured learning outcomes. In the end, we ended up with 30 studies included in this analysis. And so on one hand, this isn't very many. 30. On the other hand, this is kind of a lot because previously meta-analyses for these age groups would only have 5 or 6 studies. Okay, so let's talk about inclusion criteria. As I mentioned before, has to have a group comparing an agent to a non-agent condition, had to have enough information to calculate an effect size. We did not include process measures like eye tracking. Variables extracted, as I mentioned before, this generally followed those frameworks where we have things about study design, the descriptives, the system design, character design, how things were assessed. We wanted to understand the outcome measures. We create our own measure of study quality indicators, and we of course needed the effect size data. We also calculated an rate of reliability, which was about 90%. So we used a 3-level meta-analysis to do this. We looked for outliers in influential studies. Long story short, a question I always get about 3-level meta-analyses is publication bias. Conventional methods for publication bias don't work well in a lot of 3-level methods, so we ended up using funnel plots that are designed for dependent data meta-analyses. Okay, so let's take a look here. First and foremost, learning results. This is the one that most people tend to care about the most. We had 70 comparisons from 25 studies, and the overall effect size was 0.42. This is pretty consistent with other meta-analyses in the field. We did see significant heterogeneity. We had 8 outliers, but none of them were significantly influential. And in terms of publication bias, the funnel plot was reasonably symmetrical. So we did do some moderator analyses, and they were largely non-significant. There were a couple that were significant and were interesting. So I'm only going to talk about those 3. First, in terms of the control condition, pedagogical agents were more effective than just a regular instructional video. So what I mean by that is if you had a video and then you had the same video with an agent, the one with an agent was strikingly more effective, right? Like we see 0.93 as the effect size here. They were also more effective than other software programs at 0.47, but they were not more effective than traditional teaching. And this is really important, okay? Because whenever I talk about agents and I talk about these effect sizes, people are like, oh, so we should use agents for everything. Like they just take it way too far. And I'm like, no, like we're not replacing teachers. Pedagogical agents are not meant to replace teachers. And I'm sure you guys as researchers are probably thinking that's ridiculous. But whenever I present and talk about agents, people always want to say, can we use this instead of teachers? No, like they're a tool teachers can use. So moving on to media, we found that they were more effective when they were used on computers compared to other media, but they were not significantly more effective than other conditions when used in VR. And VR is a really interesting use case. We're going to talk about it on the next slide a little bit. In terms of the character's role, we found that they were very effective as an information source. That's when the character just sits on the screen and talks like I'm doing now. They just talk endlessly about whatever it is that they're teaching. They were quite effective for that. And they were also quite effective for coaching, but they were not effective as demonstrating or modeling. And this blows my mind. Like it's crazy because for years I've thought that's the one thing that's really unique about agents is that they can demonstrate or model something. But let me tell you something. Demonstrating and modeling has a lot of overlap with this traditional teaching, which has a lot of overlap with virtual reality. So let's take a look at the next slide here. I am going to call out one particular study, and I'm not saying it's bad. So please don't read into this in that way. I am actually pointing it out because it is very unique compared to the rest of our studies. So the study by Peterson et al. Found a negative effect size. And so in this study, they were using virtual reality. They're comparing it to an actual human, and they like for traditional teaching, and they were using demonstrating or modeling. So when we look at those results that you saw before, that agents are not more effective than other things in VR, and they weren't effective at demonstrating or modeling, a lot of that is probably influenced by this study. But that's not to say this study is bad. To me, that sparks a question. That actually sparks a lot of questions because we don't have many studies around agents in VR. So now I'm thinking things like, well, are agents actually good in VR? I would assume they'd be better in VR, but that might not be the case. We need so much more research around this. Like if you're a VR person and you think virtual humans are interesting, I please consider number one, reading the study. It's a very interesting study. There's multiple experiments within it. Quite interesting, quite well done, fascinating read. And if you read this study, you'll see that like they're asking really interesting questions, but it is very different than the other studies that we included in our analysis. So I only highlight it because it's unique and because I think it can inspire a lot of research going forward where I had big assumptions around agents in this space. I assumed agents were going to be more effective in VR. I assumed agents were going to be effective at demonstrating or modeling. I was wrong. Like, and I'm okay saying that. Like, I was wrong. So if you're interested in those types of things, please read that study. It's quite an interesting one. And know that agents in that study look different than they did in the rest of these. So when we're seeing the effect size being different, it's because agents were used in a very different type of environment. And I think there's a lot of potential for research there. So next we looked at motivation from the same, oh man, I got to speed up. Okay, next we look at motivation from the same set of studies. We had 47 comparisons from 17 studies here. The overall effect size was 0.48. Not really much else to talk about here, other than I will say motivation is a messy measure in this particular analysis because it includes a lot of different type of motivation. So I would use this as a very, very high level indicator. We have a much more specific analysis coming up in a little bit. This is the overall distribution of effect sizes here. And you can see again, the one in VR is quite a bit lower, but everything else is around the same area because they were conducted more consistently using computers and things like that. So in terms of emotions, we had 15 comparisons from 5 studies, and most of them came from only 1 or 2 studies. We did not find a statistically significant effect here, so I don't really have much else to elaborate on because most of the comparisons came from 2 studies. This is the distribution of effect sizes here. You can see they're relatively consistent, although the confidence intervals can be quite large. So in terms of perceptions, these have to do with how people felt about the learning experience as a whole. We had 34 comparisons from 7 studies, but again, they were very skewed towards 2 particular studies that had a lot of outcome measures. Again, non-significant finding. The effect size was pretty close to 0 anyway. I don't really have anything to elaborate on in regards to this. This is the distribution of studies around learners' perceptions. And finally, cognitive load. A lot of people want to talk about cognitive load. I'll rant about cognitive load in regards to agents a little bit later. I think, yeah, I don't want to talk about it now because I'll go down a rabbit hole. Okay, so we had 5 comparisons from 3 studies. Overall, we found the negative effect size, but it wasn't statistically significant. We didn't bother looking at outliers, influence, or publication bias because we only had 3 studies, and it didn't really seem like it would make much difference anyway. So what do we learn from these set of analyses that we have here? We know that agents can help kids learn, and we know that they can help improve motivation. But importantly, they are not better than traditional teaching approaches. And again, do not replace teachers with pedagogical agents. Like I hate that I have to say that out loud, but in the age of AI and generative AI, there's a lot of like, oh well, remove the teacher and put some AI in there. I don't want to get too far down that argument yet, but like people have had conversations with me about, oh, let's just have everybody work with a pedagogical agent instead of a teacher, and I'm like, I don't think that's the right approach personally. So as I mentioned before, there's really interesting interaction between a virtual reality and the role of the pedagogical agent, but there are really few studies around virtual reality. So I would really like to see more virtual reality research with K-12 students and pedagogical agents, but I know that's a heavy lift. I know that's hard to do, it's expensive, and it's challenging, but I feel like there's a lot of nuance there that we could really start to understand around how the interaction is fundamentally different in virtual reality as compared to computer-based instruction. So second, pedagogical agents don't seem to significantly influence learners' perceptions, emotions, or cognitive load. And for us, this was really interesting and important findings, actually, because we, as an institute, we're focused on the constructs of persistence and resilience alongside collaboration. And so perceptions and emotions are things that we had thought in the beginning could have potentially a really strong influence on how long a student is willing to persist. So finding that they didn't significantly influence those things was an interesting implication for us. Now, in regards to theory, this really set up our next study. First, we can see support for the general premise of social agency theory in Castle, that it could be that social aspects can influence learning because agents have social aspects that aren't there in other environments. Moving on to cognitive load theory, we really saw no evidence that agents increase cognitive load, and this was consistent with some primary studies with older learners. So last but not least, we had this really big question. What aspects of a social interaction with a pedagogical agent actually influence learning? We don't know that. Like we don't necessarily know that. So we started to look at agent design. I'm skipping ahead one, sorry. Okay, implications for practice. Agents can support learning and motivation. Very little moderated this, but they should not replace traditional teaching. So like I was starting to say before I interrupted myself, we really wanted to look at the design of characters to understand like what types of characters are actually more effective than others. And this needed a totally different sample than the meta-analysis because the meta-analysis was comparing an agent condition to a no agent condition. So here we wanted to compare an agent condition to a different agent condition and understand the nuance. So we had 44 studies that met this criteria. Again, this was narrowed down from those 112 in our scoping review. Generally speaking, we needed 2 conditions with a visible pedagogical agent, and similar to before, it had to actually collect data and be with K-12 learners. So I'm just going to run through our research questions real quick and the overall takeaway point. And the reason is because I have a tendency to say we really don't know much about designing pedagogical agents. Like I've said that for years. We know they work, but we don't really know why, and we don't really know how to design them to be more effective. And the takeaway message from our systematic review is actually pretty similar. So findings in regards to the learning environment itself, if you remember, this is like the high level of that PACU framework, the conditions of use framework. We only found 2 studies, and the general takeaway was that theory-driven environments were effective. Like we should use educational theory and good pedagogy to design the environments. Nothing rocket science here, right? Like we would have assumed that was the case, and with only 2 studies, it's hard to make large conclusions. Now, we did have 7 studies that looked at the intersection of learner characteristics and the agent effectiveness, but they were scattered across 4 different things. They looked at the amount of mental load people had, prior knowledge, the neurodiversity, and also the demographic characteristics of the learners. And basically what we found is that if we had to generalize, we'd say agents are more effective when they are designed with a specific learner in mind, especially for people with low prior knowledge. But it doesn't always influence performance. A lot of times it would influence how people felt about the agent or their experience or their motivation, but it wouldn't actually influence their learning. So then we got on to looking at the functions of the agent, what the agent was actually doing in the environment. We had 9 studies around teaching strategies, 6 around communication strategies, 3 around agent behavior, and 2 around game-based competition. So if we had to consolidate all of that into one sentence, it would be, agents are more effective when they use the same effective teaching strategies that real teachers use. Again, not rocket science, but we thought there might be some nuance here. We thought there might be things that agents do that's different, that might be effective. And that's not really what we found. What we found was that if it works well for a real teacher, agents were able to, if they were intentionally designed, get positive effects using similar strategies. So in terms of the global level of design, comparing non-human to human-like characters, overall, we found that those are better than not having a pedagogical agent, but there were really mixed results in regards to like comparing different types of agents and if the learner could actually customize their agent. So we moved on down to the medium level of design, looking at things like lifelikeness and realism, the competence and the role. And basically the takeaway here is that learners definitely preferred things. We definitely saw evidence that they had preferences, like in terms of measures of satisfaction and things like that for certain things at this design level, but there was no consistent effect on learning outcomes. And we couldn't really make generalizations about one thing being necessarily better than others because they were highly contextual and often interrelated with other aspects of agent design. So finally, at the detail level, looking at those really specific details like age, gender, clothing, ethnicity, voice type, etc. So again, we saw that learners had really clear preferences, but it generally did not translate into better learning outcomes. So the overall takeaway message here for theory, again, we see some preliminary support for aspects of CASTLE because PAs are clearly acting as social cues and they're clearly influencing some of these other processes. But few studies examine mediation, few studies examine moderation. So we really need systematic theory-driven research, not isolated experiments. One of the challenges in the field of pedagogical agents is there's very few people who have been working in it consistently and doing systematic lines of research. A lot of the work that we see with agents is people come in, they do 1 or 2 studies. Generally speaking, in the agent world, we find non-significant results, and then people leave and go on to research other things that they find significant results are and more interesting, et cetera. So we really need systematic lines of research here. In terms of practice, this is where we actually had something that I thought was an important takeaway for the systems that we are designing and probably for yours too. There's a big question about should learners be able to actually customize their character? It doesn't seem to actually harm learning. It can improve engagement is what we found. So we found some positive effects for their perceptions, their engagement, but generally speaking, if you want to improve learning, this has more to do with the agent's function and pedagogical design and the instructional strategy, not necessarily what it looks like. So again, this kind of just mirrors what I just said. Pedagogical agents should mirror proven teaching strategies rather than just being like a decoration. So there's a tendency in agent research to just be like, we can put an agent in there. And I'm like, why? The agent needs a role. The agent, like environments, in my opinion, should be designed around the agent. The agent needs to have a purposeful role in that environment. Okay, so now we're at our 4th and final study, meta-analysis on the impact of agents on motivation specifically. So this was a completely different literature search. Okay, so we're gonna push aside those ones before. Now we were interested in all age groups, not only K-12 students. So we used a very similar search string. It might even be, the only difference here is we took out the stuff around K-12. So a little bit broader search string, and we searched 8 databases and 5 reference lists. We screened about 2,000 studies again, and we ended up with 52 that were included in our analysis. These included 288 comparisons. So this gives you an idea of how many different measures people are using in their experiments. To help account for this dependency, we used correlated and hierarchical effects models with robust variance estimation, and we conducted 7 three-level meta-analyses using CHE and RBE. So these are our findings in a nutshell. these are the 7 different meta-analyses. Overall, we had one category of motivation. And what I mean by that is we first went through and tried to identify, based on existing major theories of motivation in the area that was being used in pedagogical agent research, we classified all of the measures into these different ones that you can see here: self-efficacy expectations, value beliefs, utility beliefs, interest, intrinsic motivation, and engagement. Anything that an author claimed was a measure of motivation, but couldn't be clearly aligned with one of these theoretically driven constructs, we dumped into that quote unquote motivation category. As you can see, that's the biggest category. To me, that's an important takeaway. We need to be making sure our measurement is clearly aligned with theory and not just kind of making things up, because that is about probably 25% of our sample. A little more, maybe 30% of our sample was all things around motivation. So we need to make sure that we are using very clear theory-driven measures. That was not statistically significant, by the way. The only 2 that were statistically significant are self-efficacy expectations, which we had a small effect size, and interest, where we had a small effect size. And this is quite intriguing because, as you know, as you saw a minute ago, we found that agents can improve learning with an effect size of around 0.4. So what we're seeing is we're seeing bigger outcomes in regards to learning than we are at motivation, but they're still helping improve motivation in terms of self-efficacy and interest. So what does this all mean? Generally speaking, the moderator analyses showed that agents were particularly effective at boosting middle school students' self-efficacy expectations. Out of complete coincidence, that's actually like what we are focusing on in the Invite Institute, was middle school students learning computer science type stuff and other scientific constructs. So like this was actually a very lucky finding for us, because as we started analyzing this, we were like, oh man, we might be going about this all wrong. But we actually ended up finding that middle school students found more benefits from this than other age groups, which was very interesting. It's also consistent with prior research. So the meta-analysis I did back in like 2010 or 2011 to 2013 paper, we found that middle school students found the most benefits as well. So it is consistent in that way. But yeah, I'll move on so I don't ramble. Next, we found that agents might be effective social models, but again, they need to have a specific role. There's a number of studies that are just like, so we put an agent in there, but they don't talk about what the agent was supposed to do. It was just an agent in an environment, and it seemed to have no real instructional purpose other than we could put an agent in there, so we tried it. So this comes back to the fact that we need to have a specific role in mind when putting an agent into a learning system. We really found issues in regards to the theoretical alignment of measures in studies, in that we have a lot of measures, but they aren't necessarily aligned with any theory. So I don't think this is necessarily restrained to pedagogical agent research. I think this is kind of a longstanding problem in the larger field of multimedia research. I do think this is improving. I think like as I reflect, I've been in academia for maybe like the last 10 or 15 years. And I remember the studies that I started reading in grad school, and I compare them to now, and now we have much more rigorous reporting, in my opinion, than we had in the beginning. And since we didn't have time constraints on this, we did end up with a good number of those studies that are earlier. So I think this is improving. It's just something that I really want people to keep in mind as you conduct research around whatever you're most interested in. Make sure that we have a clear theoretical alignment between the theory driving your study and the things that you're actually trying to measure. Last but not least, we really need more cross-disciplinary collaborations. I feel that like this is one of my favorite things about academia, is working with people from other fields and different knowledge bases. And we can come up with a lot of really interesting theoretical questions and a lot of really strong measurement. But sometimes it takes bridging our comfort zone and going out and talking to people who are engineers, or talking to people who are computer scientists, talking to people who are biologists, you know, whatever field that they work in, to ensure better measurement is happening in our studies. All right, so let's take a step back and think about, what does all of this stuff mean together? Well, in relation to theory, we see preliminary evidence for Castle, but it's based on so many assumptions right now. So, and I don't mean the theory, I mean our evidence being being related to Castle is based on assumptions, because few, if any, studies were actually measuring social processes. And if you remember that theory, we have social cues activate social process, like social schemata, which then lead to social processes, right? Nobody's actually measuring that. We're making really big assumptions. We are saying that if we have an agent and people learned, it has to be because of this, but we aren't measuring this. And that is a very, very, very big gap. We need to be measuring those things to know if that's actually why we're seeing these results. Second, pedagogical agents don't seem to influence cognitive load in a meaningful way. So this was a critique from a long time ago, and we wanted to re-examine it because there were still a few studies looking at it. There's still challenges with measuring cognitive load. I know people have been working in this area for a long time, but personally, this is Noah's opinion, nobody else's. Noah's opinion. I personally don't think that means there should be more research around agents and cognitive load right now. And the reason is because my personal perspective is that agents offer a lot of opportunities for this social interaction that we don't see from other types of learning environments. So I think there's a lot of potential in trying to understand what these social cues are, what social processes are being invoked, and how we can leverage this to support learning, rather than necessarily high or low level, like high level questions around some of the really basic studies. Like I did a study around cognitive load back in 2015, 2016, where it was like agent versus no agent. Is there more cognitive load? And like, for me, that was to prove a point to myself, because I had an idea that I didn't think they did add cognitive load, because I thought people would just ignore them, and they did. So like, I think nuanced questions about cognitive load can be really interesting. I think high level questions, I think we're beyond that point, and it doesn't take advantage of the advantages that agents have compared to other systems. I'm very open to being wrong about this. So if you're a cognitive load person who loves agents, I would love to talk and hear more about other ways of thinking about cognitive load in relation to agents that can really help move the agent field forward. But the way I generally conceptualize cognitive load theory, which is probably pretty narrow, because I don't really use that theory very much, I don't know that that's going to be the most profitable for helping advance the field right now. I think really focusing on the social aspects can really lead us to really interesting research. Okay, I got like 5 minutes here. So last but not least, we know that agent design matters, but we still have no real reason why or how. So it's sad to say that out loud after doing so many reviews and looking at so many studies, but we know that students have preferences for agents, but it was really contextualized, like in each individual study. There are a lot of interrelated factors. So we can't just say design an agent as a peer and it's always going to work. We don't have those types of generalizable conclusions. So what does this mean for practice? Agents are a tool. They're not a replacement for quality teaching. I hate that I say that 5 times in every talk I give about agents, but I feel like especially with LLMs and all the AI stuff, I really need to say this. PAs are a tool for teachers to use. They are not a replacement for a teacher. But that said, they should be intentionally added to environments with a clear role in mind. Just slapping an agent into a learning environment isn't necessarily going to be the best use of an agent or the time or money required to do that. And lastly, something that was actually a reasonably large implication from this work is that letting learners actually design or choose their agent doesn't seem to have any negative consequences at all in regards to learning outcomes, but it might have some positive effective impacts in how they perceive their experience. So what does the future hold? This is what I think is really, really interesting. And this is what this to me was the biggest takeaways from all of these 4 studies that we did. So first, there's a lack of research around agents in VR that qualified for our studies. I think this could hold a lot of promise to understanding the social processes involved, because VR is very, very, very immersive. But more research is needed with this area, and I fully understand that it is very difficult research to do. This is something I'm really interested in, but I don't have the capacity to do it right now, right? Like I've been interested in VR for probably 10 years, but I don't have the funding to go out and do a bunch of VR research. So it's still a gap. I hope that those of you who are interested in VR and maybe a little interested in agents are interested in pursuing this, because I think it's an area ripe for a lot of research. And I think it's the field. Jeremy Bailenson has a lot of work around virtual humans in virtual reality that I think we could build off of in regards to this. Very interesting stuff there. I'm going to stop talking about it so that I don't go down a rabbit hole for the next 5 minutes. Lastly, another huge gap that I see is we have a lack of research around processes rather than outcomes. Our field of agents is really based on a lot of assumptions on what caused the change. So we measure outcomes and then we make assumptions about the processes. I think we should be measuring the processes, and I think we should be doing mediation and moderation type analyses to understand what influenced these things. So essentially, my argument that I want to make is we know agents can help learning. We know agents can help motivation, but we have absolutely no idea what mechanisms are making that change happen other than high-level assumptions that it's something to do with social cues. So that's kind of the message that I want to leave you with. But we have one thing that we really need to talk about. We need to talk about the elephant in the room. Okay, that's generative AI, LLMs. I love LLMs. LLMs are super fun, but what we're seeing is all these people are now putting LLMs with agents and throwing them in classrooms. And so here are some general things to know. Our sample doesn't really contain any generative AI agents. Our searches were conducted in the end of 2023. ChatGPT came out at the end of 2022. there really wasn't a lot of research around agents and LLMs at that point in the literature. So our results speak to the research before that. That's really important condition to understand. Second, I really wanted to make like a public plea from to everybody who might be interested in working with agents. I've been working with them in the last 15 years, and I love LLMs. So I have a couple just like general comments after doing a lot of reviews in this space. First, if you're coming into this world of agents, please build on theory. Please do studies that are based on theory. Please try and align your measurement with the theory that you're using. Second, please try and reduce or remove confounds. Really, really super confounded studies, like they might qualify for a meta-analysis, but they're not going to give us necessarily the type of causal information that we might need. So please keep removal of confounds in mind. Third, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Agents are not a brand new thing. Agents have been around since like 1995. So if you think about that, that's like 30 years of agent research. So please read back in the previous research that's there and think about what things are still relevant and what things aren't relevant anymore. You don't have to just start from zero. So one huge advantage I think we have with generative AI is the opportunity to investigate the social aspects of agents, unlike anything we have seen previously, because we can make them truly conversational. But this is the last thing that I want to say. Please proceed with caution, okay? Please protect and respect student privacy. I am a big believer in privacy by default. I know that that is challenging in a research space, but please be thinking about that. Second, please protect student mental health, okay? Especially as we start to think about longer term interactions with agents. There's been this question of how do students like develop relationships with agents over time. This goes beyond just education and moves into other aspects of psychology. So please keep the students at the forefront of your mind as you're thinking about and designing studies. And if there's one last thing I can say about LLMs and agents, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And with that, I'm finally going to stop talking. And I cannot believe I only went a minute over. I usually talk forever. So thank you guys. I appreciate it. I am happy to answer any questions that there may be.
Thank you so much, Noah. That was a very interesting talk. I mean, I'm also very much interested in that field, and I would first like to mention that now please also post some questions in the Q&A tool. So whenever you have a question posted there, we can pose it for you in our discussion now. And maybe I would like to start that conversation a bit with framing pedagogical agents in the research field. I mean, there's also a lot of research on instructor presence, especially during COVID. So do you have any insights on how this field relates to the pedagogical agents research? Is there an overlap? Do you see any similarities? Is there anything that you would like to mention to that?
Yes and no. And I say yes and no because on one hand, I had a really interesting conversation with another pedagogical agent researcher a few months ago about, is an actual human a pedagogical agent? So like if I am on screen teaching, am I a pedagogical agent? And I said, well, it depends. Like everything in education, it depends, right? So like it depends on what definition you're using. So my personal opinion, I would say if you are interested in the effects of a real human on the screen teaching, I would look at the meta-analysis that we did together and say that is what we know about real humans. We tried to keep this very specific to virtual humans. So going back, I'm trying to remember our findings though. In that instructional presence meta-analysis, I think, is it safe to say our effect sizes were relatively similar for learning? Like a smallish, like 0.25 to 0.4 range. So we saw similar things there. I don't, off the top of my head, because I coded these studies back in like early 2024. So the details of the individual studies largely elude me, other than the one Peterson study around VR, because I just found it very interesting and it's always stuck with me. I would be really interested in studies that are comparing the social processes that are invoked between a virtual human and a real human. I know there's older research, like from the early 2000s and mid 2000s, that looked at this to some extent. So I'm thinking about an eye tracking study in particular that was done with AutoTutor that looked at people's vision and like where they were looking when a real human was teaching them compared to a virtual human. And they were very similar across the two. And so this has always been something in my mind of, to what extent are virtual humans giving the same or similar social cues as real humans, and how do we perceive them differently? But to my knowledge anyway, I think we need a lot more research directly comparing the two to understand which is better when, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. Because from a financial standpoint, I'd say it's much easier to videotape myself recording a video than it is for me to go create an agent and drop it into a video. Yeah, that's kind of just my think aloud. I don't know if that's helpful in any way, shape, or
Yeah,
form.
yeah, totally, yeah. So maybe my colleagues also have another question and we can follow up.
Yes, I do. Thanks, Noah, for this interesting talk. Um, let me pose kind of a mean question.
Oh,
Where do you believe you really pointed to the deficits of the field, right? Your lack of theory, lack of measurements that align with the theory, lack of reasonable control groups. What do you think is the reason that this field produces lots of studies, but not so informative in terms of theory and underlying mechanisms? Do you think is it focus with research groups, or is it something else? Is it a difficulty to do that? I would be interested
yeah.
in that.
So this is going to be very strictly my opinion. My personal opinion on this is the field of pedagogical agents has seen a lot of people come and go. There have been, like, if you compare it to anything else in multimedia learning or even virtual reality, like when you look at those fields, you can think of 10, 15, 20 research groups that have been systematically investigating that for the last 15, 20 years. With agents, that is not the case, really. Like, I can think of maybe 5 or 6 research groups off the top of my head that have been involved in agents consistently over a long period of time, like over more than 10 years. Pedagogical agent research has a lot of people who come in, they do 1 or 2 studies, and then they're gone. And so I'm not saying that those studies that are 1 or 2 are always not aligned with theory. That is not my intention at all. Rather, I think it is easier to be not aligned with theory if you're coming into something brand new, than if you have made a finding and then did a subsequent study and made a finding and then did a subsequent study based on that finding. So I think when you're building upon your own work for a longer period of time, it's really easy to see those theories. And so when I try and work in a new area, I'm very aware of this, and only because of working in agents where I've like my first meta-analysis on this was like 2011, 2012. And I saw this lack of theoretical alignment. And my advisor was always very heavy on align with theory, align with theory. Like, we need to be building on the shoulders of giants. Everything is about theory. Theory drives your study. So I've had that mindset from the time I was trained. But I know that not all research groups work that way. And I think I think the cycling of people in and out of the field and just not having a lot of systematic lines of research over long periods of time, that would be my guess. I also think that the standards changing in the field. So like, and when I say the field, I mean the much larger field at this point of multimedia learning, educational psychology in general, in terms of reporting and what people expect to have reported in studies changes over time. So like when I started, I think like my first study as a master's student, I'm pretty confident I didn't talk at all about validity of measures in that paper because that wasn't something I commonly saw. Now, if I were to submit a paper, I would be talking about the validity of my measures because reviewers are going to expect to see that in there. So I think it's just a matter of fields develop at different speeds. I also think it's a matter of agents are still kind of new. Yeah, it's 30 years, but since there haven't been tons of people working in it, it's still kind of new. I think large language models are similar. So I'm sure you guys, if you're on LinkedIn, you've seen these critiques of there's meta-analyses on ChatGPT. They're just getting torn up. Like, it's very polar. People think it's awesome because of their finding and they really want to be bullish around AI. Or they say, look at these things these meta-analysts compared. I can't believe they ever did this. It doesn't align with theory. And it's just very polar. So I think what we're seeing with generative AI, a lot of like theoretical work, in my opinion, is similar to what we see when new stuff happens in agent work. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's just not a lot of consistency. And I think when there's a lack of consistency, we see a lack of theory because I feel that it takes time to develop an understanding of theory and why certain things may or may not happen. Like, we need a lot of studies around the same theory to be able to really build on it. Again, personal opinion.
Yeah.
Thanks. Makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
We have 2 questions by Julia Pöschko. First, what is the effectiveness of pedagogical agents specifically for adult learning? And the second one, what is the relevance of large language model powered pedagogical agents in comparison to previous pedagogical agents?
Okay, great questions. So I will start by saying we did not necessarily analyze adult learning here. We were very focused on kids, but there are existing meta-analyses that do this. So if I remember right, there's been roughly 17 systematic reviews and meta-analyses around pedagogical agents before ours were done. I have a paper that was published in Journal of Educational Computing Research. That's an umbrella review where we review all of these. And so if you're interested in the overall effect of agents, like, because most studies honestly take place with college students. So if you're interested in that older age group, I would suggest look there because it'll give you an overview really fast. We have one table that shows you the overall effect sizes from all the different studies. Generally speaking, the overall effects tend to be small to moderate, from somewhere around 0.2 to somewhere around 0.4 has been pretty consistent across all the meta-analyses that I've seen. There are a couple meta-analyses that also look at things like intrinsic motivation and cognitive load and motivation broadly. There's one other measure I can't remember off the top of my head in one of the studies, sorry. So I would say that umbrella review would be a good place to go for just a quick overview. If you want more in depth, then each one of those meta-analyses will have a lot of detail. If you send me an email, I'm happy to email you those papers to save you some time looking. The second question was, how does generative AI compare to the existing studies? And I think this is a very important question. So something to understand about our sample. A lot of agent studies that are included in our sample are simply educational videos. So they're videos of somebody learning about, let's say, photosynthesis. It'll be a video teaching you about photosynthesis with some animation. And then there'll be another condition that has that same video, but it has a virtual character in it. That is the vast majority of studies that exist in the field. So there are some with conversational agents where the students could actually talk back and forth. There's some with teachable agents where the student got to actually like teach the character how to do things. But I would say at least half the studies are probably instructional videos. So how does generative AI change this? We're basically going from a one-way conversation to a two-way conversation. So the way I think about this is the difference between sitting in a lecture hall of 500 people compared to one-on-one tutoring. And to me, those are totally different experiences. If I am just sitting there being lectured at, I'm taking notes, I know I can't talk, I am thinking about things in a certain way. I'm processing that information in a certain way. I'm processing that social interaction in a certain way because that instructor doesn't know I'm one of 500 people sitting in the audience, right? I'm just a name on a sheet. Compare that to one-on-one tutoring that an LLM might be able to give you, for example. We can sit down. We can build a relationship with this. In real life, we'd build a relationship with our tutor. We would learn to trust our tutor. We would build trust in our tutor's knowledge of certain things. Now with LLMs, is that same thing going to happen? Are we going to begin building trust in an LLM? Should we build trust in an LLM? So we've done a little bit of work around trust with agents. And one of the things I learned from my friend her main research area is trust and automation, is that trust is a relationship. It's not yes or no. There are different aspects, like it's a continuum. And I think that is a really interesting area to look at because I personally believe we should be very informed consumers with LLMs. And I'm very interested in how we teach kids to be informed consumers with LLMs. Because as an example, I like building things. I love building things. I could never build stuff before LLMs because I'm not a programmer. But with LLMs, I can program all sorts of things. I made graphic user interfaces for doing meta-analyses in R that you couldn't do. So now I don't have to code anymore. I just drag and drop. So like, I also know, though, to be critical because it'll give me code and it'll say it's working and it'll give me a result, but it's wrong. How do we get kids to actually know when the LLM is wrong? How do we get people to know something is wrong and what they should and shouldn't trust? To me, that is part of the interest and also fear with LLMs in generative AI. And there's also that relationship aspect where as we start having the same LLM who remembers things about that learner over time, I worry about what that might do psychologically to kids as they're working with this thing, especially when, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I'm going to talk way too long if I keep going about this. I will just stop by saying I worry about the psychological aspects because I have a lot of questions around what could happen. I can see a lot of potential. I also have a lot of fears. So.
Okay, thank you so much, Noam. I think we're out of time already. First of all, thank you for your presentation and for these answers. I would like to hear more from you, but I think we also have to constrain it to that time frame now. For all those people who are with us today, I would like to announce the next speaker, but this information is not given yet because we will announce it at the joint SIG meeting at the early conference in Graz. So please join us for this joint SIG meeting. So we will give you that information and more during the SIG meeting. Also, welcome our new SIG coordinators at that meeting. So yeah, I'm happy to see you there. And thank you again, Noah, for giving these insights.
Yeah, thank you guys very much for having me, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you. Same for you for the day, and all the best for your research.
Thank you. Have a good one, everybody.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.